Welcome everyone to MinneAMA on AR and VR 101. I am Maria Plussel. I'm the Executive Director of MinneStar. We're the nonprofit community organization that puts on a lot of happenings around town, ways to connect with your tech community. So we're really excited about this topic today. Obviously one that's like a super hot topic around. I'm excited to learn from these amazing panelists that we have. A little bit of housekeeping items. As I mentioned in the chat earlier, let us know who you are. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and then just what you're excited to learn about or hear about today. So Jay already, hey Jay, how's it going? Already jumped in, said how to apply AR/VR at a low cost in the sales process for a service business. We'll jump into that a little bit later. So yeah, let us know that you can hear us. Let us know that you're here, and use that chat functionality. Another functionality, if you're new to Crowdcast, is if you look on the bottom, there's the Ask a Question function. That also gets sent to us, to our presenters. We want to have this to be a fun, casual, open conversation where we're able to get to your questions. So you can use that functionality, or you can drop them in the chat, either one. So a couple other housekeeping items. Let's see here. Did I cover all of them? I think I did. Dang, I was just so concise today. All right. So, like I said, we have Nick Roseth here. We also have Thong Nguyen, and we are going to be talking about AR and VR. And I'm going to actually let them introduce themselves and kick it off. So, Nick, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate you guys hosting this. And all the work you do in the community, MinneStar. I've always been a huge fan, and you guys are doing a great job, especially in tough times, COVID, keeping us all connected. So really appreciate you having us out today. So I'm Nick. I've been working in the AR space for the past couple years, and then just broadly technology for past 20 some years. Been very connected with the Minnesota tech community for a number of years, and I think that this topic is just a very interesting one right now, especially during the times of COVID. And we'll get into some of those kinds of questions. And I've been friends with Thong for a while, and he's in the VR space. I'll let him introduce himself, but I thought he would be the perfect person really to come at things from the VR perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So my journey in VR actually started at a pretty young age. I know a lot of people have shared this with, but I got started with software development when I was 6. And so at that time, I was just interested in building worlds, right? But the problem is back then they didn't have headsets, so a lot of it happened in your head. My VR journey actually picked up probably 5 years ago. A lot of the action that happened with Oculus being bought out by Facebook, I think spurred a lot more interest from my perspective, and I started seeing a lot more practicality. And so past few years, I've really been trying to apply VR to enterprises, all the way from the top of the funnel to the bottom of the funnel, and then execution as well. So I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more of it, but Nick and I crossed paths along this journey somewhere, and so we're both involved in the community, and so I'm excited to see everybody here today.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for everybody joining. It's such a kind of evolving topic. There's so many places that we could go with this. So I just want to give a little bit of an introduction. I don't know kind of what everybody has in terms of their exposure to AR and VR. But I think it would be good for us to just set some of the basics in place for somebody maybe, let's say, who's just really never been exposed to much of it. And Thong and I are going to kind of bounce back and forth on what is AR and what is VR and some of the differences between them. So I think maybe right out of the gate, Thong, I'll start out with a question to you. Discussing some of the differences between AR and VR, because couple years ago, I didn't necessarily even know the difference between those. So can you talk a little bit about how what's like the clearest way to delineate between the two technologies?
I'm glad you asked, Nick, because this is probably one of the best ways to confuse people right out the gate, right? So it's great just to apply clarity. So what I will say is that AR and VR are on a spectrum, right? Today, they seem different because they take up different form factors. There's different ways it can be applied. But the gist of it, though, is that today VR is in a headset, right? So you put the headset on, it takes over your entire field of vision. You can't see the outside world, although those lines are being blurred. Whereas with AR, AR actually takes on a few different modalities. So there's AR as a headset where you put on an HMD. And what it does is it overlays. So like, for instance, the Microsoft HoloLens will overlay an image on top of what you already see. What it also does is it perceives the external world. And so it will take into account the fact that I have a desk in front of me, right? So what you see in AR can actually interact, or, you know, a ball could bounce on the desk, even though the ball doesn't exist in physical space. The other modality that you see for AR today is mobile AR. So the idea that you can just use your phone and you see something on the screen that's an overlay on top of the camera. So I think just to keep things really simple, that's kind of the spectrum of AR and VR today. It actually touches a lot more than that, but we'll just keep it simple for the purpose of this conversation.
Sure. Yeah, one of the interesting aspects, and probably a lot of people don't know this, but I'm interested in like automotive AR, right? Where you have this screen in front of you and they're actually projecting AR onto kind of this window or this screen. So it's evolving fast, and it's surprising, I think, how many different industries that are actually using both AR and VR. So with that in mind, maybe start a little bit on the VR side with kind of how it came to fruition, like where its primary base has been, and then how it's been evolving in terms of any industrial applications in the last couple of years.
Well, where do we start, right? I think, so just to back up a little bit, accessibility for AR and VR has been an evolving picture, right? So the idea that the everyday user, whether business or consumer, can actually get a hold of these headsets, figure out how to use it, right? And basically bring it to their workplace and show it to others. That's been an evolving spectrum. And I think we've gotten a really a really long ways in the past, probably 4 or 5 years since I started. Today, I think when you start to touch on different industries, what I'm seeing is that there are many dabbling, but it still hasn't achieved a scale that the hype has set up for yet, right? Mm-hmm. So you see, like, literally every company we talk to has either done a VR experience, has experimented, has paid a firm to do some work for them. And this ranges all the way from the top of the sales funnel to execution, like I mentioned before. So people are using it for marketing. People are using it for product development. People are using it for sales. People are using it for innovation, collaboration, communication, all the way down to training employees on how to implement something, you know, and that ranges across industries. You asked what industries, right? And I'm sure we'll touch on a number of them. Retail, hospitality, healthcare. I mean, the list goes on and on. As far as industrial applications, I think Nick actually has a lot of practical experience, particularly within architecture and engineering. So maybe I'll bounce that question back at you, Nick.
Sure. Yeah. So to take a step back on the AR side of things, my exposure has been primarily with the HoloLens 2. There's a lot of VR, type of headsets out there. There's several AR headsets in the market. I think there's been you bring.
Oh, did we lose your audio?
Oh, can you hear me?
Oh, no,
sorry. Okay. Apparently I can't touch the cord. So AR and VR both have had kind of some of these adoption challenges. It's the AR headsets get pretty expensive, right? Right out of the gate, we're talking about Magic Leap was like $5,000. The HoloLens 1 was $5,000. The HoloLens 2 is $3,500. So there definitely has been this slow adoption. And one of the things I think that's been interesting, to the point that you had mentioned earlier, was I read somewhere about how this adoption is kind of happening over time slowly. So if we think about how the iPhone was received, and I remember thinking back to like, wow, this is really cool, right? I can put my music on it, but I'm not going to be doing all my banking on it in 5 years. And sure enough, in 5 years, I was doing all of my banking on these applications. So I think one of the challenges has been, with technology, is that technology solves a lot of these problems. It's us humans that kind of are a little slow to adopt in these very cultural changes. And so I think that in this article I was reading, it really was talking about how AR is slowly kind of spreading through the culture, particularly through the phones. And so phones, you're seeing, Pokemon Go, if we're trying to envision what AR looks like on a mobile device, that was kind of one of the big breakouts for what AR and overlay of reality, particularly with gaming, looked like. And now you can see it on Amazon, right? You open your Amazon phone on your app, and you can take a product and show it what that furniture is going to look like in your living room. IKEA's got an app out there, so you're starting to see some of this commercial exposure. But the industrial side with AR particularly, I think, has been a little bit forward with that, because we talked, VR has had a big, kind of a big following in gaming and starting to kind of come into that entertainment world. The AR side has a lot of really interesting applications overlaying, the holograms with reality in manufacturing. So if you think about, one of the examples I like is, if you think about Trane, a company here in the northern suburbs that makes air conditioners. That air conditioner might have 20,000 parts in it. And if you take a model, and a lot of times they're modeling this stuff anyways for the manufacturing process, then you take a headset, a HoloLens or something, you put that on your head, and you're able to basically pick apart all aspects of that model. You can show people step by step how you would maintain that model or install it. So I think there's a lot of really cool industrial applications, starting with manufacturing. My exposure for the past couple of years has been very heavy in construction. And Thang and I've talked about this. What's interesting in how the kind of the overlap of these two is that with construction, you mentioned like architecture and design. Design firms are designing buildings in VR, right? Because it's an entirely closed environment. You can bring somebody to what their building is going to look like, to the extent of what it's going to look like from the outside or what it's going to look like on the 5th floor. And then downstream, the actual practical implementation of those models comes through with AR, where you're actually building studs and making sure that the HVAC doesn't interfere with the electrical. So there's the way that Thang put it as a spectrum is exactly right. And so that's some of the industrial applications that we're seeing. I mentioned automotive with AR. There's just a lot of different areas that it's implemented in right now.
And that it's funny you bring that up too. Somebody mentioned in the chat up a little bit that what if we could actually do this crowdcast in a VR environment? And I think that's the whole idea is like how this could empower communication and us actually feeling like we're co-present. And I think everybody is probably zoomed out by now, right? And when you're actually dealing with construction phases that span over the course of years, how does a design implication all the way up front trickle down to everybody that actually ends up using that end product? And, one of the things that Romero was working on is how do you close that cycle? How do you make sure that you can peek into that future and understand the implications of the decisions you make today? And I think that's pretty powerful, right?
Yeah, with VR, I mean, you've done some really interesting things. I think that there's really something to this whole experiential kind of aspect that we now have new mediums to design in. We can design in 3D, and designing in 3D is very different than kind of these two-dimensional platforms that we're typically used to. So if you can say, well, what is a retail experience going to look like? One of the other cool ones that I think about is designing hospitals. So there's, if we look up front and, kind of upstream in architecture with both VR and AR. So you can design it in VR and you can bring, your board members and show them how amazing this hospital is going to look. Hospitals are, by the way, one of the most complex buildings to build of any kind of building. And so they spend a ton of time in designs in the actual mechanics of it. And so they'll design it in 3D. They'll put it on a VR headset on you to go through it. And then they put it in AR so that a doctor or a nurse can actually walk through the model to make sure that the hallway is big enough to actually get enough people through there, right? So there's these logistical aspects of designing for 3D and then showing that experience in AR. So that, I think, is one of the big powers of these devices and why there is such an industrial application. One other kind of super interesting thing that I'll make a note of is some of the military applications available in this. So fighter pilots, and again, we talked about how expensive these things are, but these big industries are investing in these technologies pretty early, because if you think about fighter pilots, they can go up and actually simulate what encounters might look like in AR that look and feel very real. So there's a lot of really cool applications across so many different industries that really boil down to this experiential application that we have not had to this point.
It's funny because when I think about what you just said, there's an interesting cross thread around learning, right? All of these folks, all of these industries are using these technologies to actually learn faster and be able to iterate, right? And I think that's a common theme when you think about AR, VR, XR, the spectrum. And I know we didn't define XR earlier, but consider that all for today's conversation part of the same group. But this idea that, by experiencing something outside of a physical environment, you can actually iterate through it faster and do basically simulation, right? Somebody asked in the chat about, education and schools. And I think there's a number of folks actually on the chat today that have been deeply involved with rolling this out to education. So they actually have more examples, maybe that way they can share in the chat box. But rollout to schools has actually been really interesting, especially in light of what's happening with COVID, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, anybody on the chat room with kids can attest to it's hard to hold people's attention looking at a screen for that many hours a day. And how curriculum is designed today isn't really meant to be super immersive, right?
Right.
And so underlying all of this learning, this idea of an engagement cycle that goes beyond what we have today, I think we're just starting to scratch the surface there of what's possible.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is the convergence of all of these different technologies kind of coming together that is going to make things a little more accessible. With devices coming down in cost, over time, eventually these AR headsets, will start to decrease in price. I think, somebody like an Apple coming into that space and really disrupting it with, all of its consumer might is going to be a game changer. And that will continue to evolve over time. I think these technologies that help the actual creation of content will also be another critical component. But things like 5G, I mean, if we're talking about the, some of the challenges faced in the construction space, you're on a construction site and you need super high throughput to be able to download some of these models. I've seen some really cool experiences, immersive education experiences. And I think about this stuff for, my daughter, where it would be cool about something I even would be super interested in would be I love history, but to walk through a field, right? Take a HoloLens out to a field, and see it a battle scene or something like that, or think about kids being able to actually experience the Gettysburg Address, in Gettysburg when I stop there, right? That is kind of where the future is going. And I think it's going to be super powerful for education because it is going to create immersive experiences. And I think that as that starts to get down to a younger generation, just like I mentioned earlier with the iPhone, now that those tools are accessible, I mean, my daughter can, almost operate a 3D printer. What is she going to create when, when that future is there, that augmented world is there, faster speeds like 5G. I just think there's so much possibility out there with these technologies as they're kind of coming together.
Yeah, watch out for kids on VR and AR, right?
Yeah.
Seeing that in action.
Follow up on that, Nick, just in the chat about the educational environments and children. Do you have any thoughts on just VR developing social skills?
Yeah, I mean, right now I think about, if we kind of transition topics into COVID, like, my daughter's not getting any social skills right now. That's super difficult, right? I think if there are really cool applications like spatial IO in the AR space, and I'm sure, Thong, you can probably mention a couple in the VR space that really create these immersive experiences that are super important, I think, for the development of kids, the collaboration and creation, of new ideas. So I think that these technologies are going to help that. Of course, there's always probably something to worry about in those types of experiences. But I also think that, like AR is being used to help with PTSD for combat veterans, right? To re-experience things in a different light. So I think that there's all these different applications. I wish, my daughter could be playing a game virtually right now with her friends, because they're trying to do it on these phones, right? We don't have the technology completely there. But I think that if kids can play games together, if they can kind of feel like they're in the same spot, I think that would be tremendously helpful now with COVID. And I think there are other applications for, if there are specific groups of people that could be helped by these experiences and experiential aspects of these technologies, I think it could be super helpful.
I think to follow on to that, the big thing about these mediums is they bring in additional context, right? And let me explain that, right? So today we're talking on Zoom, right? And somebody even called out in the chat. Usually it's just a talking face, right? You can't even see people's hands, which is actually why I moved the camera so you could see my hands. Learnings from VR, right? But this idea that a lot of the mediums that we work in today are so compressed. We're compressing a ton of information into the smallest package possible, and then somebody on the other end has to expand that information again, right, and fill in all the gaps. And if you look at how much of society works today, a lot of that happened because the pipelines were small, right? So books, right? Printing, books, the internet, bandwidth has increased over time, which has allowed for richer mediums like video and eventually AR and VR to kind of proliferate. But I think a lot of the assumptions today are, well, this compression is so efficient, right? I can buy a book for $5 and get all this information that somebody had. But what we don't talk about is what is the loss in that compression, right? How much information and context do you actually lose? And even something as simple as a Zoom chat, right? How much information are you losing out of this, as opposed to if we could actually physically be present and talking together? And so again, right, this idea of some of these technologies are starting to open up bandwidth for humans to connect, I think is a fundamental theme across all of this. And that pertains to social interactions. It also pertains to information and knowledge and context. Right? When you're in AR and VR, there's a context that's additional to what you were able to experience before, not to mention a whole nother dimension, right? Today, we're compressing everything into 2D, right? And then expanding that back into three dimensions. And I can't tell you how many times companies have made mistakes because of that compression and then decompression process. So I think that's can't be understated.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point there with the compression and the distribution mediums. I think between like the book example, right? I can read, a book that has been turned into a play. I can read that book and get one experience. I can listen to the audiobook and get a different experience. I can watch it on the TV, and I think about like Charles Dickens. This is a time where we always go, to the Guthrie and experience that. This year we can't. We can listen to it on audio, but it's going to be a very different experience than actually being there in person. We can watch it on TV; it'll be different. But I think this, the context that you're talking about, I think that is a super interesting point of what these technologies are able to provide us.
Just kind of responding to some things in the chat too while it's kind of going on. Otherwise, we'll lose them. But Apple is going to be part of this game soon. And to tie a couple different threads together, we talked about adoption earlier, and there are some challenges to that, right? Getting the headset, getting the hardware. I think companies like Facebook have made it much easier. You can buy an Oculus Quest 2 for $299, right? And from purchase to setup and getting up and running, they've really optimized that engagement cycle. And so today it's easier than ever to get into it. But the challenge you face is sort of the stigma of VR, or the stigma of putting on the headset in the first place, right? If you're a technophobe and you don't like technology, who's going to convince you to do that? Is your kids playing games? Because perception of games is a whole nother topic. But I think, to speak to some of the things on thread, there are certainly perception and usability issues as far as the customer journey into getting into VR goes. And I think those are the things that are really being addressed today. And I think we'll see a lot of development in that heading into next year as well.
So that actually brings up a good point. Thong, you had raised this as a question to kind of go over. And I think it's an important one, because thinking about what is the state of AR and VR right now from a market perspective, I've got some statistics. Statistics are everywhere around what the potential is for this. Everybody's got an idea. One of the ones I was reading yesterday said that AR VR is projected to have an annual revenue of $1.274 trillion in 2030, going from 37 billion in 2019. So compound annual growth rates go anywhere from 35 to 45% for the next 5 to 10 years. And at the same time, places like Magic Leap, basically went from a $6 billion valuation to a $450 million earlier this year. So it's contextually challenging to explain, the difference behind why those things are. And I have my thoughts and ideas around what some of the market struggles for these, particularly hardware companies. Daiquiri is another one in the construction space that had $250 million of investment and shut their doors last year. So these hardware companies are struggling a little bit, but meanwhile, we have all these projections that things are, going to be, exploding. So do you have any thoughts on how we manage those two thoughts in the mind at the same time?
Yeah. So I'm sure a lot of you lived through the .com boom, right? I'm just thinking back to the early days of everybody saying that the internet was going to be the next big thing, right? And the level of skepticism that you had from organizations, individuals who weren't early on that adoption curve, who would basically say, well, why would online replace a store, right? Why would online even compete with a store? I should be able to go in, look at my thing, and walk out and check out, right? So we are very much in that early stage of adoption for this whole medium, right? I think there's a lot of questions today around, well, it's so easy to buy something on Amazon. Why would I even want to put a headset on? What I will say is that VR and AR are different than the internet. They're different than the things that came before it. And what's really taking time is exploring those use cases and really exploring what customers, consumers, and users are going to engage with and driving that forward. But what I would say is when we have this conversation in another 2 years, 3 years, it's going to be completely different. I think we'll be much further along in that curve. And again, accessibility of devices. So, I would be curious to poll the audience, right? How many people have headsets? And we can do this later at the end, but how many people have headsets? They own one, they use it, and they're engaged with it versus how many are not. Maybe we can do some surveys later.
Yeah, that'd be super, super interesting. I think part of it is the market ready. What parts of the market are ready, and I think that what we've seen, we've had. I remember we had a discussion, part of Twin Cities Startup Week. It was probably a couple of years ago now, and we were talking about this exact same topic, right? And we're still talking about that exact same topic. And the truth is that AR VR moved off of Gartner's hype cycle in 2019. 2019, it was no longer on that, right? So Gartner is saying this is not no longer hype. It is, an actual working technology because it worked its way back up the practical part of that curve. But still, there's, some questions around it as to its usability. I think VR is going to continue to evolve in a whole bunch of spaces, some of which we've already mentioned. Entertainment. One of the things that I wanted to bring up was earlier this year, a hip hop artist, I believe, Travis Scott, netted or grossed $20 million for doing a live virtual concert, right? In a time in which we can't go to concerts. So I think that this impact of, what COVID is, it's going to be kind of creating this idea that necessity is the mother of invention, right? That we kind of have to try new things because the old things aren't working. So entertainment definitely is one of those avenues on which it will continue to grow and get popularity as those devices become more accessible. VR is certainly going to be cheaper than AR. And I think that the AR side of things, because those devices are more expensive, it's got different applications, those are going to be adopted more in the industrial side of things. As I mentioned, manufacturing, construction, automotive, and some of the more scaled things. And so that's how I would kind of see the picture of that evolving over the next few years.
Yeah, I find it interesting too that we're kind of bouncing between sort of the industrial B2B application side, right, versus the consumer side. What do you think is the relationship between the two, or what are some of the differences in behaviors?
Well, I think that, it's part of it is what's the hardware look like, right? Like we're not going to go around wearing, a HoloLens or a Magic Leap anytime soon in our just day-to-day lives, right? Like
I did it last week, but there was nobody on the bus, so it didn't matter.
So, I think that that's one of the things in terms of how practical is AR. This is why I'm super interested in what Apple does, because there's, AR, just to, to get into a little bit of the weeds around AR's got a lot of challenges. The biggest one being light. You're basically projecting and kind of emulating light sources in your eyes, right? Those holograms don't exist without light. And so you have these glasses in which it is creating light. So what are you going to do with, that with Apple glasses in a sunny day, right? Is that going to be practical? Because there are, some of those challenges in reality, but we're certainly not going to go around until we get those more, smaller glasses for us to become a little bit more mainstream. I think part of the biggest reason, that Google Glass failed was just like, people are like, what? That looks stupid. It's like, what value is it providing me? They just weren't ready for it yet. But I think eventually they will, because culture has adopted to some of those social norms. The technology has become more practical. I mean, I would definitely argue that these technologies are still on the early edge of the early adopter curve, and that the mainstream piece is probably still even a couple years away, if not more. But I think that it's going to be the combination between social norms, the hardware becoming more practical and socially accepted, and the value that we're getting out of them. Like I said, like Travis Scott doesn't make $20 million earlier this year without COVID. Doesn't happen, right? He was able to get in front of 15 million people in a single concert. And so it's a lot of different things, but that's why I'm super interested about what COVID is doing to this space, and why I'm very bullish on it, because it's forcing all of us to kind of rethink how we interact with technology. And as these systems become more available, one of the really cool things I wanted to mention with AR is this concept of spatial anchors. So if you think about, Google Maps with basically, having these triangulations of where you are in the world, think about that three-dimensionally. So I'm not only going to be placed in 3 dimensions, but I'm going to be placed in 2 dimensions. I'm going to be placed in 3 dimensions. I can actually go, in the construction space we talked a lot about, I can walk through the construction site. I can see something that wasn't right, I literally click my fingers and do an audio note, and there is a Post-it note sitting in the 3D space right there, right? So when I come back tomorrow, I've got a reminder that says, was this done? So I just think that those, things like the cloud connection plus 5G plus AI, ML, and these technologies is going to just continue to grow, where we just can't ignore the value that it's providing to us.
I'm loving the points that you're making, and to kind of back up a little bit to the point you made about the convergence of technology getting harder, right? More difficult problems are being solved. That kind of combined with the social ramifications of it, there's so much interesting work being done in that space. Even something as simple as like, what's the value of eye contact? You and I both know that when we're talking with each other, eye contact's important. In a Zoom chat, it's okay for your eyes to be wandering everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. Like contextually, that's totally fine. But imagine you and I standing face to face talking, and I'm looking somewhere else, right? And the technology today, like if you're wearing a set of AR glasses, if you're looking off into space and having a conversation with somebody, that's a great way to get shot out the door, right? And so even taking cues like that and figuring out how to work social norms into that technology. I mean, you wouldn't believe how much time I've personally spent basically writing code to drive, avatar eyeball movement so that it looks natural, so it doesn't freak people out when two people are interacting in VR, right? And there's tens of millions of dollars of research going into just that alone, right? How do you provide comfortable presence for people interacting in VR? And I think that social foundation is so important to this medium being able to scale, right? Because as the technology gets better, our brain starts becoming more discerning about what's okay and what's not okay. That uncanny valley of social interaction is definitely there. And the more you work in VR, somebody asked, well, what's cutting edge right now? Cutting edge is actually being able to replicate social interactions in a way that's comfortable for people, right? The idea that you can bring your persona into a virtual space and swap out the context, that interchangeability, that is cutting edge stuff. Hundreds of millions of dollars of research being poured into that right now. So it sounds like rocket science, but in a way, we're actually trying to replicate reality and what's available today within a different technology platform.
Right. And we absolutely saw that with, things like, some of the challenges in AR, like if I'm walking through a construction site, for instance, I don't want to see this thing moving, right? Like the models move in AR, right? It's one of the challenges. The accuracy of these devices, particularly from the AR perspective, is that, you are tracking, you're using computer vision to effectively recreate your entire world. So it has to do tracking. Like I have a table in front of me with one of the great features about the newer stuff coming out is I can literally grab something and I can put it down. I'm even seeing haptics like gloves and vests that actually recreate more and more of those actual experiences. So that's a super interesting space of how do I actually interact with all of these things? How do I feel pressure? How do I feel like I'm actually immersed in this thing? So I think that some of those applications are interesting, but the fact that I have to recreate this microchip on effectively the side of my glasses, right? HoloLens is pretty small. I've got a little bit of processing power back there, and I have to recreate the entire world. I'm constantly scanning my environment in order to recreate it in 3D, and it knows how far things are away from me, so that if I set something on the table, it knows that it should be there. But if I walk 10 feet, it's going to move because it is constantly calculating those things. And that's one of the challenges I would see in what are some of the applications. Those problems have to continue to be solved. It's this mixture of hardware, firmware, software, but it's really challenging things because, like I mentioned, light, shading, how objects are shaded could change how close they look. So some of these technologies are going to, kind of continue to have to evolve with some of those challenges that are kind of developed over time. But I think that we're light years of where we were 2 or 3 years ago. You asked about one of your questions that we talked about was, how is finger tracking, right? Like HoloLens 1 to HoloLens 2 is like 100x improvement. One of the pains about AR is that you have to, typing a keyboard into anything is a nightmare, because in HoloLens 1, you're doing it one click or one, keystroke at a time. With HoloLens 2, it knows where all 10 of my fingers are all the time. And I'm able to actually, particularly with the 2 index fingers, I imagine eventually that'll be really tracking, and I can interact with all 10 fingers. But if you pull up your hands in 3D, you see them mapped in 3D. So, those types of innovations, I think, are continuing to evolve, and they're going to continue to allow us to, to use these things in practical applications in different ways.
Yeah, I would agree. Hand tracking, eye tracking, body tracking,
Yep.
right, on a larger scale, are huge topics of research and development right now. For those of you on the call, check out Hand Physics Lab. So just Google Hand Physics Lab on YouTube, and you'll find some really interesting stuff that's happening in the VR space right now. A lot of work to understand, right? What is our perception of our hand? So it starts to get really abstract really fast, but how do we represent our appendages in virtual space in a way that actually starts augmenting your ability to interact with things? So I'll leave it at that. You guys can look that up for yourselves, but there's some really interesting research going on. And this idea of being able to manipulate your perception. So what you do, what you see versus what you feel, and starting to separate that out. That's probably a whole nother AMA for a different time. So
that research, and that gets deep. It's very expensive, and it's like whole schools are trying to figure out some of the answers to those things. And I think that's interesting in terms of the evolution of this technology, is that there's a lot of partnerships with education institutions that are trying to answer some of these questions. There's a lot of research papers out there on just the psychology and kind of human mechanics. I bought a book called Augmented Human that I'm reading that I think starts to talk about like some of exactly that point of how am I getting used to adopting this technology that I'm effectively completely immersed in, which is very different than, it's a little bit of that transition to the phone. And now I think it's even a bigger transition to these technologies.
Yeah, the implications are enormous. Another thing you guys can look up is the TED Talk that I did about 2 years ago too, and I cover a handful of different applications, including healthcare. And I know we don't have a ton of time today, but again, that's a whole nother area that we could probably spend time on, is what are the ramifications of AR and VR in healthcare, be it, caregiver training or CBT, cognitive and behavioral therapy, all the way to reinventing the patient experience. You could dive real deep into that, and there's some fascinating research happening there.
Yeah, healthcare is one of the biggest industries. I think that this is going to continue to evolve in, where a lot of money is going to continue to flow into that, because there's just such a Steve Jobs always talked about like the 10x in AR. I think in healthcare and a bunch of these industries that we're talking about is a 10x, given enough time, research, and practical use.
So I guess moving on to a slightly different topic, we talked about healthcare and like understanding your environment and your body. What does that raise for you in terms of security and privacy issues? Like where is that headed? What's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, like, so the security side, I think that's interesting. I think that the privacy side, those are some of the big social aspects that we're going to have to kind of deal with, right? Google Glass was probably the first implementation of that concern, where if I'm wearing a camera, how much is being recorded? Like if I'm having, you mentioned eye contact, if I'm wearing AR glasses and I see little stuff going on, are you paying attention to me, or are you checking your email?
Maybe I don't want you knowing where I'm looking, Nick.
Right. Yeah, I think that security piece is going to be, security and privacy are going to be some of those ramifications, legal aspects, right? This is a whole different world, kind of, I think we went through some of it with, this transition to the phone. And I think we're going to end up with some of those, same aspects. I also think it's, the security is going to be based on the entire infrastructure pipelines for what all of this data looks like, right? There is going to be the fact that you're on a VR headset or I'm on a AR headset. We are streaming data to a Wi-Fi router that is uploading and going back and forth with an Azure cloud server or whatever. So it's, there are security aspects of what information is on the device itself, what is happening with that data in transit, and what is happening with that data in the cloud. I think that there's definitely new stuff there. I also think that there's kind of some of the foundational principles around, do I want to see my credit card number in my glasses? Probably not. So a bank is probably not going to let you do that, just like they try to avoid it on the phone. But I think it's going to be based in line with some of the existing infrastructure and social norms that are out there with these applications.
It's a crazy topic to dive into when you start thinking about integration of devices closer to your brain, right? It starts to understand more of what you see, what you think, what you feel, and what the ramifications of that are. If any of you have watched Black Mirror or The Social Network, right? It could go in so many different directions when you start to think about how this could be monetized. So I think that's a topic that's not going away anytime soon.
Well, and I got, I think with AR specifically, one of those questions is, well, when do we get to Minority Report, right? Like, when am I, Crime Stopper, and I see all this stuff in front of me, I can customize things like advertising, right? One of the things that was shocking in Minority Report is that advertising becomes more about, when I'm on my way to the train, I don't see the same advertising that everybody else does. I start to see ads specifically customized to me out in public. Like, what are the ramifications of that from an industry perspective, from, privacy, all of those things. I think those are all topics that everybody is going to have to kind of make their way through as these applications become available. One of the challenges I think that's out there right now is for adoption is these marketplaces are virtually empty. Like, there's not, and I mean, maybe it's better in VR, but with AR, HoloLens 2 apps, the number there is in the dozens, right? We're not talking about hundreds and hundreds of applications. This is still new stuff. And as the technology becomes available, there's still kind of a gap between when the hardware is available and when the software and the practical applications available. So I think that these questions we're talking about, these cultural adoption questions, are really going to probably start ramping up over the next couple of years as we start to see how these technologies evolve with practical applications, in real environments.
Cool. And I know we're kind of approaching the end of our time. I just remembered some stats that I want to leave the audience with. We were talking about learning, right, and how that cuts across so many different industries. So PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, recently did some research to try to understand what the efficacy of VR is in terms of learning. And the numbers that they came back, which are really fascinating, this has been reflected in other studies, which is learning in VR is actually 4 times faster than in the classroom from a time investment perspective for the individual learner. Learners end up feeling more confident about the knowledge that they've actually learned. They also are 3.75, and that was a number they provided, not me, 3.75 times more emotionally connected to the content. And whether that's, the medium or the design of the curriculum, right, you could probably drill into that a little bit more. Because of the form factor, right, you aren't distracted. Learners were more focused. So they spent less time with less distractions. And at the end of the day, they did some metrics around scalability of learning in XR. And what they found is that at 375 users was sort of the break even with having a physical classroom. Whereas once you start to get to 1,950 users, you start actually developing parity with e-learning. So in terms of scale, that curve starts to look interesting. And then you start getting much, much more cost effective once you go beyond that. So
Sure.
interesting research from PwC if you guys are interested in the learning aspects of VR.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's going to be interesting. I think you mentioned something also, focus. One of the things, sitting down with people in the construction space specifically is, one of the, we didn't really bring up this, but I think it's super important, is safety. Safety is a big concern. I mean, so in construction, if you're so focused on and immersed in this experience, there are cases like the HoloLens 2 brightness and clarity is so, it blocks out things behind it. And so you could be walking straight off a building, right? Because you're too focused on that. You can't see beyond the actual holograms in front of you. So, this content in both AR and VR is extremely immersive and really focuses people, potentially to a detriment in some, certain practical applications. So I think that's just another one of those cultural evolutions that we're going to be, kind of figuring out in the coming years.
So much to think about, right? So I know we have about 7 minutes left. Would it be a good time maybe to turn it over to the audience, see if we have any more questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
I know we've been kind of tracking the questions all along, so hopefully the queue isn't too long, but if anybody's got any burning stuff that you want directly addressed, maybe we can speak to that.
We do have one question that came up early on, and it is from Kay. Kay says, what do you know about personalizing holograms at a cost that can be purchased by individuals? Think like Santa says hi to your child using their name in a residential window hologram.
Super interesting question. I think a very good topic, because from the tech stack side of things, the code is only half the battle. And one of the biggest things I think that is expensive or challenging or takes time to create is the actual 3D models. And I think from a strategic approach, companies have to have that modeling as part of their cost structure and strategy about creating products and environments. I think more and more in the future, you're going to be able to have a marketplace of these types of things where you might be able to say, like, hey, I want to show somebody, right now in a HoloLens 2, you can spin up dinosaurs. My 8-year-old has been just blown away by, she can have a Tyrannosaurus Rex right in front of her and step inside their mouth, right? I think over time, you'll be able to personalize those more. Right now, doing the 3D models can be time consuming and be expensive. But I think over the coming years, you're going to see more of, like I said, Train built that air conditioner in 3D. They're going to let you use that because they want construction companies to know how to install their products. So I think that's going to be, an important piece of that. These libraries will become more available. And right now, those marketplaces, I think, are being built. So you will be able to go download Santa and kind of customize your own message in probably the next 12 to 18 months if you can't do it already.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that, and I don't know if this was where the question was headed either, but in terms of personalized holograms, I think you're seeing a lot of the early adoption of that today, like with things like Snapchat filters. The idea that you can overlay something and modify reality that's already there, and that's getting tons of traction, right? I think that's only going to expand.
Great point.
That's a great point. We got a couple more questions coming in. This one's from Davis. Do you have recommendations for programming and or hardware resources for getting into the development of VR or AR content?
Great question.
You want to take a swing?
Sure. So I wrote down a couple of things. I think one of the most important aspects is access to a device. Like, you really just need to be able to immerse yourself and kind of start to open that imagination and see what's possible. Maria, is there any way to kind of send some of these links? I mean, we're happy to put some stuff together, but like for the HoloLens specifically, you're going to be working in Visual Studio and Unity. Unity is going to be, that's probably half the battle, is learning how to the overlap between the actual, C#, language interacts with the actual models. And then there's something in the Microsoft space called, I believe it's the mixed reality toolkit, and that comes with kind of that's the play school version of kind of getting started. And then really looking into any of the 3D applications, right? There's open source ones like Blender or SketchUp. I mean, you have to get comfortable with 3D models to really be building applications in the space.
Yeah, and what I would add to that too is if you're a developer, right, there's a lot of ways to get in. If you're not a developer, look at 3D asset development, design. There's a lot of 3D software packages out there that you can use, like Blender. On the development side, even if you're not a developer, you can actually start. There's enough resources out there where you can do it codeless, right? So both Unity and Unreal, which are the two predominant engines that drive a lot of AR and VR experiences, let people who don't know how to code actually build experiences. So that's a good place to start.
Yeah, Martin also commented, said, I don't know if you saw my reply in the chat, but two of the most popular development environments or platforms are Unity and Unreal. The local VR and HCI meeting has been happening in Altspace, and it's a great place to meet other developers. So thank you.
Yes. Zach Went is the guy that leads that session. They meet every month or every other month or so to talk about human-computer interaction, various interfaces, and a lot of that involves AR and VR. So feel free to check out those guys.
Nice. All right, we have two more questions. First one, this is from Samir. In the university setting, how do you see adoption happening? Will there be a VR lab, or would every student get a VR set for their classes?
Yeah, actually, that's funny. I mean, I talked at Mankato State University with their architecture and construction team, and the first thing I told them, because they're like, "This is amazing. This is industry transforming." And I said, the first thing you got to do is buy hardware. You have to get, because I can't even bring it up on this screen and show you what AR looks like. It'll at first glance it'll be like, wow, but once you put a headset on and actually interact with that environment, it is mind blowing. So I think education institutions are going to have to take it on in those initiatives to actually buy the physical devices so that students can actually immerse themselves.
If you look around too, there are many, many higher ed institutions that already have a lab. Mm-hmm. So if you just look, you'll find them. If you start looking at high schools, right, they're probably dabbling, but there's not a lot of formal work there. And then grade schools have a lot of the lower end headsets. So they're out there if you look. If you're looking to start something at your school, there are probably resources that we can share as well. It's easier to start now than ever.
Yeah, even like Microsoft will, have partnerships with schools that helps them access some of those things.
Fantastic. All right, last question. This is from Joe. How do we convince politicians to address XR concerns, privacy, ethical, child protection early on, so that they're not getting it too late, like social?
I am not smart enough to have the answer to that because I don't know if it's going to happen.
This is a whole nother probably AMA, but the idea about regulation and where that fits into an emergent space, and how do you temper the regulation so that innovation can still happen without throttling it while still protecting the consumer. And I don't think that's limited to AR, VR. That hits brain-computer interfaces. It hits machine learning and AI. It hits basically every significant topic that we have to deal with today. So my sense is that in 30 seconds, we need better answers for that question.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I just feel like we're behind on, AI and ML alone. And typically there needs to be some sort of an event that is actually going to force that to rise above the other topics of the day.
Agreed. Well, with that, I think that's a good place for us to start. Thank you so much to Nick and Thong. This was jam-packed with content. Thank you. We might have to do another AMA to hit on all the other aspects of it. So I really appreciate you staying here. Appreciate the audience. Great questions coming in. This is the last AMA of 2020. So hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your year. 2021, January, we're kicking it off on the 13th with accessibility practices to implement in 2021. And on the 27th, the secrets of high performing product teams. So keep an eye on our Crowdcast channel. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
Thanks a lot,
Maria.
everybody.
This has been great.
Yeah.